So, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us at this group therapy morning session for all of us in schizophrenic position of researchers and activists, but also the ones that are trying to, I don't know, make their research useful for the social change. Two of us are Dušanka Milosavljević and Sara Nikolić. We are doctoral students and researchers here at Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory, but also still are or were activists active in different social movements and initiatives here in Belgrade. We also know each other from protests in 2017 or from
Seven Demands movement.
Yes, we had our own movement. Yeah. We also had experience of joint squatting that brought us closer together, and Dušanka is retired now, and I am still a part of a collective called Solidarity Kitchen, which is a mutual aid collective that prepares food for people in need. And I also did some research on social movements, and sometimes I cannot sleep because of that experience.
Were we also together the members of the Joint Action Roof Over the Head?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. And later today, or tomorrow, if today rains, we will take you to Belgrade activist tour, and you have small maps over here that you can take and maybe Google something that you see on that map before. As we had opportunity to hear several times from the beginning of this conference or yesterday, that concept of weak civil society really dominates the analysis of mobilization and contestation in Central Europe, in Eastern Europe, in the former Yugoslav region, or in the Western Balkans, even as mass protests frequently occur in these regions. And since the 1990s, the increasing utilization of the term participation in public policies runs in parallel to the decreasing attention paid to the material and cultural conditions that constrain the engagement of people in public affairs. Participation has been institutionalized, subjected to market strategies of city governance, and mostly restricted to therapy and manipulation in a way. And not surprisingly, radical urban movements or radical left urban movements have become skeptical about emancipatory potential of participatory action research and its capacity to advance movement-relevant knowledge. The critics have argued that it is not enough to merely amend our methodological approaches, but for the research to become meaningful and reflective of the struggle, it should push the boundaries of academy from within. In other words, social movements researchers should use academy as a site of struggle to challenge our academic positions that make the academy inaccessible to those that are on the outside. So now I will, let's say, take a hat, very unflattering hat, and be the devil's advocate and very kind of harsh. And I will try to express the distrust and concerns and critics that radical left urban movements often have towards researchers coming to research them. So the activists who practice, whose practice is being researched are neither blank slates nor empty vessels. We are often two researchers, academics, journalists, cultural workers, and so on. But other researchers tend to forget that and tend to have like some idealistic version of an activist who acts on impulse and on values and not really as a rational subject. But as Gazela said yesterday, activists are experts too, or even better, activists are reflexive practitioners. And it appears that scholars oftentimes position themselves as theorists whose roles are limited to using movements as objects of observation or as a test case for their hypothesis or something that they already read somewhere. And they, in a way, the researcher acts as an external observant who approaches a movement, grabs their knowledge and their trust, and then leaves the scene without any substantial contribution to their practice. These inquiries in social movements are predominantly based on semi-structured interviews or on some short-term participant observation. According to politically involved collectives that I was a part of and that I had a privilege to collaborate with, the researchers are rarely open to communal discussion about the purpose of their research, about the funding of their research, and about their methodology. They often impose pre-formulated and non-negotiable questions, and those questions are sometimes, especially with young researchers, let's say master's students or even PhD students, they come as ill-designed and as if they didn't did their homework to prepare and learn more about the movement before they approach it. And also there's the issue of the collected data, because it's usually disseminated beyond the scientific journals. It's mostly disseminated in scientific journals and scientific conferences, such as this one. And activists don't really read empirical papers. I mean, they do read theory and they do read empirical papers that help them advocate for their cause if they need data, for example, environmentalist movement. But if you're writing about internal democracy or founders' burnout and things like that, it's really not very likely that the movement members will read that. Not because they are not ready to face the harsh truth, but because they already know it. And they already spent hours and hours debating on their meetings about that, or even trying to think of internal mechanism and procedures how to cope with that. If they didn't tell you about that, it just means they didn't trust you enough. So another issue that is related to dissemination is that, of course, we researchers, in order to save our jobs and to get our paycheck, we need to publish in peer-reviewed journals, usually in international peer-reviewed journals. And a scholarly article that is published there, I mean, not only does that paywall, of course, activists are really keen to the copyleft movement, but and they are very familiar with pirate websites. But from the activist perspective, it appears that the main goal of many of the social movement researchers is just career advancement and scholarly validation they will get when they publish their paper. And then also there's the paywall, but also there is a scientific jargon and the dominance of English language that makes the research sometimes inaccessible to those who contributed their knowledge, their time, their trust, and their experience to the production of that knowledge. And then, not surprisingly, activists consider these modes of knowledge production invasive and voyeuristic and exploitative in a way, and as prone to misinterpretation of their resistance perspectives. And then also another critique that really often comes from the radical left and radical urban movements is that from the activist perspective, many researchers of social movements, of such social movements, put excessive emphasis on identity building processes and then blurs the whole political part and engaging part of their work. But I'm also a researcher, and my position allows me to believe that rigorous and collaborative and movement relevant research is really possible and that it should be applied. but of course there are many kinds of research and many kinds of researchers. But basically, if research is to produce knowledge which can be incorporated in activist practice, it needs to be respectful, ethical, and also meaningful in terms of the existing worldviews of the activists. And there is also another topic that's relevant for me, which is that kind of solidarity between scholars or researchers and activists. Because we as researchers now are also affected by the changing political and economic landscape, but reporting on struggles of others for those causes that affect us with a supposed objective distance, or joining labor unions related to only academia or science, to better our own terms of employment is important, but still, in my perspective, not really enough. And I strongly believe that we researchers and activist researchers have a responsibility to altogether do something about that. So yeah, those are things that I wanted to say, and maybe some questions to think about are, how do we, if I know that some of us are in double positions, how do we negotiate our changing roles? Does that affect or endanger our position somehow, especially under authoritarian regimes? And how do we adjust our research design and dissemination strategies in order to make our thoughts useful behind this collapsing ivory tower?
Thank you. Do I need to speak in mic, or if you, okay. So thank you. Yes, I want to start with questions for you, and then we can all speak together. I just wanted to say that about what you just said, that there is this emerging need for researchers that are researching activism to work in solidarity with this movement, so that activists do not feel like they are this objectives of some study, but then that there is this challenge of creating that critical distance from those happenings and activism itself to produce some knowledge that is objective or not value-based, and that is maybe impossible, but I want to hear your side of it. So first of all, how many of you are in this double position of being activists and researchers? So if you are, just raise a hand. Yes. Okay, so maybe 50% of you. And how many of you are researchers that are researching activism? Okay. I thought that we had a different percentage, but that's okay. So yes, we wanted to hear about your experiences being in this twofold, how it's called, dvostruka, yes, position, and what are these methodological or, I don't know, ethical or personal challenges that you find? For me, one of the biggest questions is the question of loyalty. So when you are in this double position, where do you see that there is loyalty to the movement? Is it loyalty to the science? Is it loyalty to yourself? And in that way, how do you perceive your identity in these situations? Okay. If any of you wants to start. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm Andrija Šoć from Faculty of Philosophy, Institute of Philosophy. Retired activist from 20-something years ago, but currently researching various relationships between theory and activism. And I just want to make a few observations, following up on the loyalty that you mentioned. It seems to me that, and there's more and more papers on the consequences of this publish or perish tendency that concerns the reproducibility crisis, and the notion that vast number of papers that are published cannot be reproduced, and research in social sciences and in natural sciences alike isn't immune to this. So one thing that seems to me to be sort of a heuristic problem is a researcher's loyalty to his hypotheses. You know, you begin with an idea, I have to be original, I have to publish this, and you formulate a hypothesis that you think is very good, but then if the practice starts to disprove you, you tend, perhaps because of the loyalty to the hypothesis, to stick to it and not modify it along the way. So maybe a useful guiding heuristic could be to adopt a sort of mechanism of refractory equilibrium, which Rawls talked about, you know, testing a principle against some sort of set of scenarios, or in this case, some sort of particular participative actions, various forms of activism that you encounter, and then modify your hypothesis slowly, also trying to apply it as you go along to different sets of scenarios. So this sort of abandoning, say, a generalist approach. There is a sort of movement in political theory toward particularism, and political realists are very keen to favor it against some sort of political generalism, any sort of influence of ethics into politics, actually. That's where it comes from. Looking each scenario as it presents to you without any sort of preconceptions, and perhaps researchers who, at least that's what I think, it's not always easy because of different biases sort of ingrained, and this is also a heavily research topic, to accomplish it, see what the empirical observations give me, then formulate a hypothesis, then test it against empirical observations, then modify it again until I reach some sort of a more comprehensive, more accurate notion of what it is that I try to prove or disprove in the first place, not really having in mind that sort of publishing pressure, you know, at least at the beginning of the research. And with that, I just wanted to ask a question for, according to your experience, there was again in political theory, a sort of thesis put forward by Diana Matz some 15 years ago that there is some sort of opposition between deliberation and participation. She's one of the researchers who think that there is some sort of opposition between those models. And her observation was, and it has faced criticism, but her observation was that those who have tendency to deliberate have less tendency to participate, and vice versa. So perhaps your experience with activists who don't want really to be, to think about what you as a researcher want to impose, maybe they were those sort of participants who don't like to deliberate too much in the sense of reflecting too much on what it is that I'm doing. Yes, to some degree, but I have some sort of guiding idea that I want to apply or put forward somehow or make benefit of. So did you encounter these sort of tendencies that deliberators tend to participate less and vice versa? So that's it. Thank you.
Well, I think I didn't, or but it is also because I never researched a movement that I'm a part of, and I really try to, I don't know, because of the loyalty and ethical reasons, try to keep those separate. And we had a good response rate when we researched other social movements, but I don't know if any of the other colleagues had this experience or can comment on this.
Okay, thank you. I'm Anna Matano, Faculty of Political Science in Zagreb. I don't really research social movements. I research participatory and deliberative practices. Yes, there are problems, but I think it is difficult to ask the researcher to, as the colleague said, you have to be true to your research, to your hypothesis, not in the sense that you should not change it, but you know, like you should follow your way in your research. And I'm thinking a parallel situation with my colleagues who are researching political parties, and they research all kinds of political parties. So you cannot really ask them to be loyal to all kinds of political parties that they're researching. So you need to be loyal to your research process. But what I think is something very important that you mentioned is giving something back to the movement or to your subject of research, in a sense that that would be my proposal as some kind of ethical guideline to try to present your research. Of course, if those who are the object of your research are interested, to them in a way that is accessible and understandable. I think that can be maybe something that would, I don't know, I'm asking, it's not I'm asking, do you think that would be something that would make the situation better? Okay.
I don't want to sit here as an expert on activists' perspective, so if anyone other wants to, yeah.
Thank you. I'm Carlo Crowley from Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence, and I felt a lot of anxiety while I was listening to Sara, because this double position of an activist and a researcher makes me feel at the same time frustrated for the kind of injustices that are created by researchers, but also feeling a bit responsible for the very same kind of mistakes and misunderstandings that are created by the researchers. So to add up to the anxiety, I just wanted to maybe make 3 comments. First, 2 comments actually. First is related to the relevance of research questions that we ask. I'm coming from social movement studies. I was socialized over the last 5 years in this very specific area of research, and what I see while I'm trying to, you know, write papers and get them published, is that I'm very often pushed, and even more so in international journals, to ask highly theoretical questions, you know, in order to articulate them as some kind of theoretical contribution. And as I'm doing this, very often the utility of research for the specific movement that I deal with really doesn't exist anymore, in the sense that it's extremely hard to translate relevance of social movement theory to like specific cases of social movements and kinds of strategic dilemmas they deal with, kinds of problems they deal with, and generally, I mean, these are also, I would say, 2 very different motivations and 2 very different levels of thinking about what is going on. And also I would maybe add up to this that social movement scholars very often do this kind of historiographic or quasi-historiographic actually work, which is often far away from the immediate needs of activists. So we end up explaining former causes, things that happened in the past, and we very often do not really try to make them particularly relevant for the contemporary moment. And we are also not pushed by journals to do this, because this is not something that is perceived as important. Another thing is, the second thing that I wanted to say is related to my experience of fieldwork, where I think this overwhelming logic of competition and very individual competition between scholars makes us do this kind of very repetitive interviews and fieldwork with the same movements over and over and over again. While I was working for my thesis with Don't Let Belgrade Drown 2 years ago, I felt that at least 3 or 4 people are in parallel following the same movement. Same people are being asked the same questions, and there is something about lack of collaboration, especially between scholars who engage in this kind of intensive qualitative work, where I believe that some of my colleagues and myself could have maybe done collaborative work in order to get the data and then analyze the data on our own in our individual ways. But the problem is, of course, that qualitative research very often is, I feel like, it's very often individualized, even more than, quantitative research is much more often collaborative because it relies on these large data sets and large teams of analysts. Maybe we should think about qualitative research in that way as well. Maybe we should kind of organize and at least collect the data together so we don't spend so much time asking the same people the same questions.
And those people won't be fed up.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, maybe even in some specific contexts, this is not my experience, this is one of the experiences I've heard, research on refugee crisis in Berlin, for instance. I mean, in Berlin, there are no more activists or groups that are interested in, being interviewed by researchers coming from all across the world, because they did this dozens of times, and I think this happens in every place, and I completely understand this because it feels almost as if you're giving interviews to the media. You're just kind of.
It's even researchers from the activist perspective. I think that researchers are worse than journalists because from journalists they ask you stupid questions, but at least you get some visibility. And
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, that's a very good point. Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, that's it.
So a slightly different experience, but also reflecting on some research on movements that I've done in the past, actually. First of all, I think actually I did the opposite. So I did research on movements where I was part. And it has all sorts of complications, but there's no research in that field that doesn't have complications. And in a way, it felt like I didn't leave, publish the paper and leave, because I was part of that movement. So it had a different feeling and a different, I think, in the complicated field where we are, I think still was a best way of approaching it. I've been reading more recently like the work of Hyven and Kasnapshan. I'm sure I mispronounced them. The book is called The Radical Imagination, and they did a really interesting piece where they actually talk about two really interesting things. First of all, research as a convocation, as they were themselves researchers in this group. I think it was in Canada, if I remember well. And yeah, and the second thing that I found was really interesting, and again, it resonates a lot with my experience of activism, interviewing people from your own movement, a movement where you're part of, and you're not leaving, so you're staying there with the issues that you have. It felt like a really useful moment for many activists to actually offload a lot of the tensions of, doing activism as a thing that many times doesn't go into, fulfillment is not a fulfilling activity most of the time, unfortunately. And it was actually that reflexive elements that you were mentioning. It became a thing like that was done through the group talking and discussing the issues and being able to do it with somebody who was part and therefore trusted. They did a book in the end, but I'm sure they're still also very active. They've got blogs. They've been very much talking about that, those actions, and I think that was maybe a good example to look at. One other thing that I wanted to mention that is more related to where I'm now, a democratic society, we talk about democratizing research. And that is, of course, not just thinking about activists, but thinking about citizens and other groups. And we've been talking a lot about dissemination and how do you get the dissemination part of like the final report, whatever it is, to people, and that has all sorts of complication. But an interesting thing that we're exploring there is actually how you can share, not just to disseminate the results, but share the resources for doing research, the tools or the knowledge. So a thing that we're experimenting at the moment with a project we're doing is like doing peer research, where we're training non-researchers by background that are asylum seekers to do research with asylum seekers around the specific issues that we are exploring. But therefore we're not going to do the research ourselves. We're training people to do that through that peer support, that peer research approach. And I think that is also something interesting. So you're not sharing the final dissemination. You're not sharing simply your results. You're sharing the that capacity or competencies or skills that you need for inquiry. And I think that is actually something that people can continue doing after the time of the whatever project you're doing or research that you're running. So that's another interesting, I think, example. That might be a different approach.
Yes, it's so loud. There's also another tool that's why I called my colleague Katarina. Maybe you can join us. I think it's the best for you to tell about the engaged Balkan community, which is the platform that we're working at one project called Engaged Democracy Initiative for almost 2 years now. And it's a project dedicated to the networking of activists and other engaged citizens across the Western Balkans region. And one of our goals was to create a tool that can help them share their knowledge, experiences, connect better, and also to connect better active or engaged parts of academia with these activists. Well, I wanted to say, for those of you that are struggling to share, struggling ways to share this knowledge, because when you just publish in some obscure, how do you say, exclusionary journal, activists don't read them, and you cannot really make this knowledge useful because you cannot make it visible for not only activists, but for citizens in general, and it cannot be put in use for any broader social change if it's not readable. So one of our goals with making this tool, Engaged Balkans Community, was to create a digital space where also researchers can share this knowledge with activists from across the region. And yes, but I wanted Katarina, to tell you more about it and the ways that you can register there if some of you are interested in participating in this.
Hi, yeah, I'm Katarina. I come from the European Forum for the Balkans, and Dušanka and I work together on the Engaged Democracy Initiative. So as Dušanka said, so the idea of this initiative from the beginning was to connect and to collaborate with activists from across the region. So we focus on the Western Balkans because we see that there are many grassroots local initiatives in communities across the Western Balkans, but that they don't have either capacity or knowledge of other maybe similar initiatives that exist in other countries in the region. So our idea was to create infrastructure that would allow them to connect and to work together. And then, since we were working in COVID times, we also came up with the idea that having a digital tool would be also helpful, since we were not able to meet in person. And this platform, Engaged Balkans Community, is a result of that. It's a closed platform, so our idea was never to have a huge number of members there, but instead of that, to create really like a safe virtual space for both activists and for researchers. So after this session, I will stay here for another 10 or 15 minutes, so if some of you are interested to join the platform, you can approach me, and then I can explain you the logic and everything. But we see already now, so the platform exists now for 5 months. So of course, it's a process in the making, but we already now see all the challenges that have been mentioned in the discussion. So first, there is an issue of language. So, okay, there is a knowledge, and this is the knowledge that we wanted somehow to translate to activist communities and to make it useful for them. But then what we see is that first, even when something is produced by researchers, it's not very read by activists. So I think that there is also this language barrier that exists because it's not always easily understandable to them. But it's also the issue of, I would say, that's also an issue of time, because if you, as researchers and members of academia, write something, I understand that you don't have time now to simplify your research in order to make it more useful for activists. So this is one challenge that we see now. And on the other hand, based on regional meetings that we have in the last few months in the region. What is also visible is that even when we give, let's say, access to maybe maybe activists that are new to these researchers, there is no much interest of making some sustainable connection or sustainable collaboration with them. Everything is very ad hoc. So it's, okay, we collaborate for this particular meeting on this particular topic, and that's it. We don't see much of the, let's say, effort to create long-lasting relationship. But that, I mean, could be the case that these researchers, they already have connections with some activists that are useful to them or that are close to them. So they maybe don't want to expand this network. But yeah, in a nutshell, that was the idea of our platform. We hope that some of you would find it useful. We would like you to join, to explore it. We have 5, say, themes that we recognize that are relevant for the entire region. So, I mean, yeah, I don't want now to talk more about it. But yeah, I think that it could be relevant for you because it would give you an access to activities from the region, and they also would have a value of being in touch with you and then having an access to knowledge that, yeah, they can find it useful. So that's, yeah, from my side.
Yes, so that could be one of the ways to connect.
But also now I'm thinking, for example, I'm again speaking from this critical left perspective, that would oftentimes have problem with the donor community facilitating the relationships between different social movements and researchers, and as that kind of platforms can be seen as taking away the agency of the activists to connect themselves on their own terms with the movements or initiatives that they mapped as strategical partners. So, but it's a good initiative, and I think it could contribute to both to the activists and to the researchers. But I'm seeing that perhaps some specter of the activism will have problem to be included there. But for the others, it can be very useful. But now I also wanted to. Yeah, sure.
I just wanted to comment just very quickly. This is very patronizing. Not what you said, but what you said that the donor community would think or would have problems with, as if the people in the region don't influence each other and don't speak to each other unless there was a platform or unless there was a conference or unless, I mean, there are influences and there would be influences anyways and connections between.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I know that some movements wouldn't register on the platform because they wouldn't want to be part of a donor community facilitated
okay, then I misunderstood, I'm sorry.
Well, I'll try to connect, you know, what I wanted to say previously with this conversation. So my story is similar as yours. So I'm a political theorist, so I don't do empirical work, although I did a lot of interviews in the previous period for various reasons. And I actually didn't know what to do with them. In terms of, you know, basically integrated this in my proper expertise of research. But in the meantime, when I started actually interviewing a civic movement, a civic initiative turning into a political movement where I was, you know, a sympathizer, not really a member. So I did the first round interviews with the idea of having my own hypothesis, that is theoretical, but at the same time with the idea of this might be helpful as as something that they could use as well. I've never published it because in the meantime I actually became very involved. And then for me, I had a problem as a researcher because I actually didn't use any of these, because I didn't know how to make it useful for the journals, you know, to fulfill all these criteria, because this is not, I don't research social movements, so I wanted to actually use, you know, ethnographic methods for theoretical reasons, for different type of concepts that I wanted to explore. But at the same time, I also had this, the question how I justify my position, because, you know, some parts of the research have been done before, and now I'm actually, you know, with these people I interview, I now work very closely, and so it was strange, and I still feel like maybe there is something valuable and I should publish it, but you know, I have problems in academic sense, not in terms of the services that I offer to our movement. And in that sense, I wanted to say that to link with this story, how researchers can help different activist groups, political movements, parties even. I know that, yeah, we need a lot of knowledge, but unless we are academics or very interested into reading, a lot of people don't have time, and they read a lot of other things, and they don't necessarily recognize how this would be useful to them. But now, thankfully, we have YouTube and various other platforms where you can create video, you can actually have a talk, and you can record this. But even better is just a conversation that is intimate, that is not public. It's something that you do research and you offer it. I think you think this would be useful, but then people will have questions, and then you realize that you didn't publish it because it doesn't fix the requirements of scholarly expectations, but actually you do have a lot of information or things that you thought of but did not fit into your paper that you can offer. The strategical issues and various other issues. And I know that we do this. We ask people, that we think have some knowledge to just talk with us. And it's also much easier for them to talk if this is not public, but also for us to actually ask questions that we want to ask. So I'm not saying this is anything secretive. It's just that it does not, I think you lose a lot of valuable things for practitioners when you try to put them in a particular form that is required, either by donors, either by academic jargon, So these are all different forms. I don't now question that there should be, they could be criticized and everything, but there will always be some forms. We will not be able to escape this. But also there is a lot of things that we know and we didn't use in our research that are actually valuable for someone, just for some kind of reflection. For me personally, a lot of theoretical dilemmas that I have, I recognize them on every single day in very, very different processes of decision making, of discussions, and sometimes it helps me to maybe analytically separate things and explain it to other people, give them words that they don't have. But oftentimes I'm puzzled myself. I can't help with anything. I think for me personally, I'm here to solve my academic problem, not my political problem.
Well, what you said, that because we have 5 more minutes, maybe to end with a positive example. When I know for a situation when a social movement reached an invited researcher, okay, hey, come, talk to us, we want to learn more. It was Jelena Vasiljevic, our colleague, and she writes about solidarity and political solidarity, and this Solidarity Kitchen that I'm a part of, but I didn't influence this decision. Someone from the movement saw Jelena on TV or on YouTube speaking something about solidarity and on difference between reactive and political solidarity, and the movement that has, our motto is solidarity, not charity, and everything is about the politicizing the solidarity and mutual aid in the public sphere in Serbia, and sharing food, of course. And then people asked, oh, Jelena, she works with you. Do you know her? Can you invite her to make like a workshop, like a closed session with her to discuss? She can help us to strengthen our arguments for the media, for ourselves, and it can also help us because when you are a part of social movement, especially some that has that anti-eviction movement or this soup kitchens and things like that, that you have a lot of practical work and you don't get to think much about big concepts that are important to you and that led you to start with this. And that kind of external stimulus can help you actually make time to talk about things that are really, really important to you. And I think that those different ways of dissemination are very important because it reaches out to people who can hear it and then call you as an expert on your topic, and they are experts from practice, and then you can help each other. Yeah.